Hey everyone, Cleo here, welcome to my channel, and today we are wrapping up the month of February, and I'm also giving you my haul for February and then balancing out what that means in terms of the amount of unread books that are left on my shelves. So this is the first month in which I use the pile of possibilities format rather than a TBR, and so at the end of the month I will let you guys, at the end of the video, I will let you guys know my thoughts about that change. But so I had put 10 books on my pile of possibilities. I did finish 10, it's just not the 10 that I put on there. So out of the 10 that were initially on that pile of possibilities, I read 8, and then I started a 9th, but that one will be carried over into March. I read 2 extra books that weren't included in this pile of possibilities, and so 1 book I had to abandon altogether. So actually pretty good. So I was actually totally on a roll this month with my reading. So while doing the video for the February pile of possibility, I already told you guys that I couldn't talk about 3 books because they are part of the BookTube prize, and so I can only talk about my experiences with these ones after everybody has had a time to read them and everybody has been able to give their thoughts on them through the voting poll. So you can expect my thoughts on those 3 books that I won't be including here at the end, like somewhere in April probably. But so I can already give a small teaser in saying that I absolutely love these ones, and I finished them before the 10th of February, I think. So I had 3 books down before the end of February, before the 10th of February, and I started to see how I was on a roll and how I was actually able to probably finish this entire pile of possibilities if I kept up to that reading pace, and that kind of motivated me to keep on reading. In the end, I definitely slacked down at the end of the month because some of the books I wasn't enjoying as much, but I'm totally happy with the way that my month went overall. So I'll be talking about these books in a rather random order, I guess, but I will first talk about the ones that I read for the February challenge that I put myself. So for February I challenged myself to look at the highest rated books on Goodreads on my unread shelves and to kind of see about prioritizing some of these. So I had put 3 on my pile of possibilities. I ended up reading 2, one of which I DNF'd. So the book that I read for this challenge that I absolutely adored is A Monster Calls by Ness. So this is an illustrated edition. I think it only exists in the illustrated edition, but I'm not entirely sure. And so these illustrations are just absolutely gorgeous, and they are absolutely fitting with the sort of tone of this book. So this is a very dark, a very grim book. Nonetheless, it is still a book that is very much suited for children as well, maybe a little bit children of an older age, but it's very much dealing with difficult situations. So the boy in this book his mother is diagnosed with cancer, and so the book is very much an exploration of the emotions that this situation evokes in the boy, and about how to deal with these emotions, how to process these very difficult experiences in life. So around the start of this book, this boy starts to wake up from his nightmares and he is visited by a monster. This monster wants to tell him 3 stories, and in exchange he expects a true story at the end of the 3rd story that he tells him. The monster always shows up at the same time. He doesn't know what makes the monster show up. Now this book isn't just about these 3 stories that the monster tells and about the story that he will then tell in return. It's also very much about his day-to-day, about how to deal, about how he is dealing or how he is failing to deal with the illness of his mother, the difficult situation of having to live with his grandmother for a time being when his mother is in hospital and too sick to take care of him, and very much also about like the push and pull of family in these times, you know, about how he needs his family to take care of him, but at the same time he's kind of pushing his family away because they're trying to prepare him for some news that he doesn't want to receive. So it's very much about dealing with these very heavy, very dark, very hard-hitting emotions. It was beautifully done. The illustrations totally matched the style and elevated the story as well. I loved it. I really think it's gorgeous, but of course, as you can imagine, based on the subject matter, it might not be the book for you if you feel like this might be too heavy to dive into because of a personal experience, for example. Second book that I read for this challenge was the Tales and Poems of Edgar Allan Poe. Now, before you shoot me down, the reason why I believe the rating is so high for this one on Goodreads is that it bundles up a lot of different editions for this. So it doesn't just bundle up this specific edition, it bundles up a whole lot of collections of Edgar Allan Poe's work. And a lot of these collections will have different short stories in them than the one that I did have. I didn't realize before buying this, I bought this like probably already 10 years ago even at this point, but when I bought this I didn't realize that they had two collections, and one of them is called Tales of Imagination and Mystery. And so you can imagine that what I was expecting out of a collection of Edgar Allan Poe's work is actually the other collection, Tales of Imagination and Mystery. So I know Edgar Allan Poe from his like horror stories, from The Telltale Heart, from The Raven. The Raven is actually in here, but so I knew him more from his dark, from his gritty stuff. And so this is not that. So this is a collection of all of his other stuff and his poetry. But I would say that his poetry I didn't necessarily get along with that well, because I don't like poetry in general, I guess. There were some nice ones in there, but I really just don't get along with poetry very well in general. In terms of his stories, there were a couple of stories that I liked, but really not enough. He has a very like scientific way, expositional way of going into his short stories. He begins most of his short stories as if he's writing a non-fiction work or something like that, and that's really not a way to get me into a short story. The short stories that I liked most mainly had some sort of a nitty-gritty element to them to turn things around, but a lot of the stories I ended up giving up on because I just couldn't get through the like sort of exposition at the beginning of them, and at the end I just decided to DNF it at 80%. Because I tried some of the short stories that were in the remaining 20%, but I just always after 5 pages gave up on them, and then there were like 3 left, which I just said like, you know what, whatever. I've given it enough of a go. I've read 400 out of 475 pages. I think I've given it a fair shot, but this specific edition just wasn't for me. So if you see this edition, the Collector's Library edition, know that there are 2 collections. There's the Tales and Poems of Edgar Allan Poe, and there's the Tales of Mystery and Imagination. So if you want more of his typical stuff where I feel like he really shines, then you need the other collection. Next up, let's talk about the first book that I finished this month, the one that I was absolutely dying to get around to. I had hoped to be able to finish it in January, but in January I didn't have enough time after finishing my challenge, and that is Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Toshikazu Kawaguchi. So this is a time travel novel, but before you get too excited, this is definitely a time travel novel for literary fiction lovers, or for Japanese literature lovers. If you love time travel literature, you need to be aware that this is not going to be like any of the other time travel novels that you've read. It's not a sort of big adventure to go back into the past and try to change things in the present, because one of the major rules of time travel in this book is that you can never change the present. Whatever you do in the past has zero effect on present circumstances. And so this kind of calls up the question of why would you even travel to the past if these are the restrictions. So this novel is set in a cafe in Tokyo where it is possible to travel back into the past if you sit at a certain spot in the cafe. The spot, however, is mostly occupied by a ghost, and so you have to wait until the ghost leaves the table in order to claim her seat and travel into the past. When you decide to do this, you are given a cup of coffee and you have to return back to the present before that coffee is cold, or otherwise you will become the next ghost to occupy that seat. So I really love the rules and the regulations of this whole time travel thing, and I love the way it explored this whole concept of you not being able to change anything in the present based on the past. So it kind of dealt with like this whole question of why would you travel to the past if you cannot change anything. So it was also saying like that at some point this cafe became super famous when this got out, but then like it quickly dwindled because people like heard that they couldn't change anything in the present, and then they were like, why bother then in that case? But we do see that there is actually a reason for these people to revisit the past even though they cannot change anything. So I thought this one was really intriguing. I really liked it. I gave it a 4-star rating in the end because it just didn't have that 5-star feeling to it. But I really liked it and what it did. But it's very much an instance of Japanese literature. I feel like Japanese literature has a very beautiful way of describing things, but it always stays like small in a way, you know, it never goes to the big bombastic plot or anything like that, and this is a very, this is like a case in point. So if you're a lover of Japanese literature or literary fiction, I would say give it a go. If you're a lover of time travel novel, I would still definitely encourage you to read it, but just know that it's not going to be like an adventure story with time travel included. It's going to be something totally different, and so if you're open to that, I would definitely encourage you to read this one. Next up is a fantasy novel. So one of the other goals for 2020 is to read more fantasy, and especially to kind of try and catch up to everything that is on these shelves. First one is the 5th season by N.K. Jemisin, and I cannot believe that I hadn't read this before because this has been on so many people's radars for the past couple of years. I'm happy to see that it was like only published in like 2015, so I'm not too far behind neither in terms of the timing for this. Only 5 years of delay on this one. But so the 5th season by N.K. Jemisin has kind of very big status just because all of the books in that trilogy have landed a Hugo Award nomination, so they have all been lauded, which is kind of like it's not common for trilogies to have every single book lauded this way, but I've really enjoyed this one. I will say that it's a difficult one to get into, and I feel like the first 250 pages or something of this, I liked it. I was getting along, I was intrigued, I was interested to find out more, but I was also not going through it at like a breakneck speed or anything like that, and I wasn't like feeling like I had to, you know, I wasn't dying to get into the rest of this. But then things shifted, and I definitely read through the final half of this book like in one day or something like that, so I definitely got into it a lot more, and that has everything to do with the approach of this novel. So this is not your typical fantasy novel in the sense that it does not give you a whole lot of like it doesn't give you a lot of support in discovering the world, you know. You don't have info dumping at the beginning, for example, or a whole lot of world explaining happening at the beginning. You're kind of thrown into this world, you're terms are thrown into your face that you have to kind of discover the meaning of yourself through context or through repetition throughout, or you kind of just have to go with the flow for them. I did discover afterwards that there's actually a glossary at the end, so if you feel like you need to go and check up a term, you can. So there is actually a glossary at the end. I myself personally am used to reading everything in a language that's not my native language. With English I no longer have this problem a lot of the times, but if I read something in Spanish, for example, I will have this problem. And I'm kind of used to reading over stuff, you know, if I don't understand something, if it's not essential to understanding the phrase, understanding the page, then I will just go over it and let it be like that. So for me this was actually something that I'm just used to doing, so I didn't necessarily mind that some of these terms I didn't fully understand. I could just have like a vague idea of like what they meant. But so this could be a problem for you going into this, so do know that that's one of the difficulties of getting through this. And this is kind of reflected also in the perspective. So we have 3 perspectives that we are following throughout this book. One of them is the second person narrator, so you're also shifting between types of perspective throughout. But you feel, or at least I felt from the beginning, I was kind of trying to figure out whether there was a relationship between these different perspectives or not. So even in terms of the perspectives, you're kind of trying to puzzle your way through, trying to figure out what the deal is. So I really enjoyed this. I thought it was an interesting world because we're following a world in which Earth has kind of turned against people, you know. At some point in this book they're talking about how man kept on exploiting nature more and more, so very relevant to our present situation clearly. And at some point Father Earth decided enough is enough. He shattered the surface of our Earth. There were quakes, volcano eruptions and stuff like that, and this is happening over and over again. And the worst times are called seasons. Those are like the times in which basically humanity has to kind of go into survival mode, and which whole communities might have to move or are annihilated through some sort of a natural disaster. And so I really loved this kind of whole concept. I also loved like the exploration of power, because the main characters that we are following are all origins, as they are called. So they have the power to kind of tap into Earth's power. So they can subdue quakes, they can produce quake, they can feel vibrations of the earth and things like that, but they are looked down on a lot. They have this very big power, and this power is constantly used because with Father Earth being such a negative force in this world, these origins are needed to subdue Father Earth, they are needed to control quakes and things like that, but they're very much looked down upon because in their history it is said that they are the ones who really angered Father Earth, they're the reason for this whole backlash. And also, like, an origin needs to have control, because if an origin doesn't have control, he becomes super dangerous, and so a lot of people look down upon them. When they find a child who manifests powers like this, then they often kill them and things like that. So it's an interesting look at this whole sort of like power dynamic, where these origins have extremely big powers of their own. They have big power in the sense that the community needs them, but they also are very much restricted by a sort of like system that has been put in place in order to make the other people feel comfortable with them around. So I really like that, and I'm very much looking forward to reading the next one. I still need to buy it, I still need to see whether I'm going to squeeze it into March, but I didn't put it on my pile of possibilities, and yeah, it is already too long, so we'll see what happens there. Next up, I read the 5th book in a series of unfortunate events, The Austere Academy. Don't have too much to say about this. I really loved it. It kind of did some new things once again. So I had been saying when I first read like the first 3 of these that I felt like they were too formulaic, and that if they continued like that, I didn't want to continue with the entire series. But they've definitely been breaking from that a little bit in the 4th one, but here as well. So they're telling the right people, so they're telling certain people about what's happening to them, they are believing them, and they are learning not to tell everybody about what they suspect. You know, they're learning not to immediately tell like the adults, like, this is Count Olaf, because they will always say that that's not true. So they're learning to kind of contain themselves, to contain their plans in order to not have their plans leaked to Count Olaf and things like that. There's also an introduction of a new element, the VMW or the VMD, I think it's VMD, which is an element that apparently is going to come back throughout the rest of the series, and that has been hinted at now, so I'm interested to see where that storyline is going to go. And so then I also added 2 books that I hadn't initially planned on reading, and they are both audiobooks because I've been really into The Sims and I needed some more audiobooks to listen to while playing, so as to feel like I'm doing something productive. First one of these I have very mixed opinions about, and that is The Binding by Bridget Collins. So I had initially I wasn't that interested in the premise, and then I reread it a few months later and I was like, why was I not interested? This sounds totally up my alley. And then I found it in a second-hand bookstore, so I knew like, okay, this is my shot, I can now have it for like a very cheap price, so I bought it, and this month I got around to it, and I didn't like it. I don't remember what star rating I gave it, I think 2, because I feel like the marketing is so off for this one. So the premise for this one is that we are following a bookbinder, but in this book binding is a lot more than just making a physical copy. Binding is very much a force that is being used in order to extract memories from people. So this is a power that can very much be abused as well, and we see throughout the book instances of the abuse of this power as well. But we start out by looking at the more like genuine form of this, where people who have suffered some very traumatic situations and who want to get rid of these feelings, who feel like they cannot continue with these memories, they seek out the help of a binder who will then bind these memories for them, keep the book safe, and then they can move on with their lives. However, throughout the book, what I find the most interesting about this book is about showing how this power can be abused, how people might pay for other people to get bound, yeah, how people might pay for other people to get bound and then redo the certain harm that they had done before to that person, and how they sort of see it as a sort of like power game, you know, where they have all the information and they're kind of constantly playing with the other person and wiping that person's memory so they don't remember, and then doing it to them all over again. So very perverse situations are possible here. Then you also have binders who just kind of drive off of this business where they don't care too much about they don't really care about their practices too much, and they are selling these books to other people, even though they're kind of, even though that means that they are selling off a life basically. So that I found to be interesting about this whole premise. The problem is that the only part that I really liked in this book was the second part. So is the binder that we are following, the binder that we are following at some point sees that there is a book with his name on it, so that he also at some point got bound. And so the second part of this book is basically his binding. It's a story of what it's a story of the memory that he tried to get rid of, and that part really was the best. Actually, if you can just read part 2 without reading part 1 and 3, I think it's definitely possible. I think you don't need part 1 and 3 to be able to enjoy part 2. Part 2 is very much a story within a story. Part 2 was so beautiful. It's very much a slow burn romance. You're slowly building up the romance. It's a male-on-male romance, and it's done so well. It's done beautifully. You don't just see them like initially. You don't just see the initial attraction and like the push and pull between these two youngsters who kind of don't want. Like at least one of them doesn't really want to admit the situation as like that you as a reader are already recognizing, but you don't just see that. You don't just see the movement from this sort of like refusal of the relationship in towards an acceptance. You also see them together for a little bit, and then you see the sort of reason behind why the binding happened in the end. But and I thought that was brilliantly done, and I actually feel like this book should totally be marketed as a male-on-male romance and as a wonderful love story gone awry or something like that. But I feel like parts 1 and 3 really didn't work. Starting out the way it starts out really puts the book at a risk of getting DNF'd. I almost DNF'd and I almost never DNF'd because I was just so bored with it, you know. I just felt like I felt like I was already halfway through the book or something and nothing had happened, because in the beginning the voice that we are following is very passive. He almost does nothing. He knows about nothing. He doesn't know what binding is about, and because of this premise you already know what binding is about, so you're also not that interested in figuring out, you know, what binding is, because you already have the idea behind those things. And so he's very passive at the beginning, and that really, the tone of that really didn't work too well. And so it's really only in part 2 that I started to care about this character, and then it makes the big mistake, in my opinion, of, so you've gotten through part 1, you've fallen in love with these characters in part 2. In part 3 I would have really wanted to see this character, you know, in part 3 I would have really wanted to see what this character does after knowing what has happened, how he changes the circumstances he's landed in based on this knowledge. But what we get is a shift in perspective. We shift to another perspective of another character who has had his memories bound, so who also doesn't know of certain events that happened in part 2, and so we are kind of back to square one, you know. And I really hated that. I really felt like that was just a plot device used to stretch out the story longer than it needed to be, and so I really didn't get along with that book in that sense. So I would say part 2 5 stars, but the entirety of the book I would land at like 2-3 stars, maybe no 2, probably more. So I really hate to say that, I just feel like this has so much potential, but the structuring of this story and the marketing of this really let me down. And then the final book that I read that I can talk about is an audiobook, and that is Kim Jiyoung, born 1982. I don't remember the name of the author. I think it is Nam-Joo, but I will write it down here if it's not. This book made quite a splash in South Korea a few years ago when it was published there, and so it's finally got translated, so it is only just out, I think, in English. I think it was published in January or February, somewhere like that. And so I was really excited to get around to it, so I listened to it on audio because it was available on Scripps. So it's quite short also, so it's a nice short read to enjoy, and it's very much looking at the role of the female in South Korean society. I definitely think it's not restricted to South Korean society. A lot of the examples can definitely be, like, a lot of the situations can definitely be recognized in our Western culture as well. Some of the more like cultural aspects to it, of like the reasons why girls were preferred to boys, like that is a lot more recent, it seems, in South Korean society than it is in Western society. In Western society, I think we've stepped away from that concept already for a longer period of time, but that doesn't mean that the larger resounding effects aren't still in our society as well. So it's not just it's looking at the life of Kim Jiyoung throughout her like infancy, childhood, like teenage years, working career, and things like that, when she became a mom, all of those times, and the effects that her gender has had on that experience. And it's not just looking at hers, it's also looking at the experience of her mother and her grandmother to some effect. And it's basically showing that even though throughout that entire time a lot of things have changed, and a lot of more options have become available to females, there are still these sort of basic thought patterns that are at the center of our reasoning on our thinking about what a girl is supposed to do versus what a guy is supposed to do, that have not managed to get rejected by society at all. So basically, in order to easily talk about that, for example, if a couple lands in the situation where one of them has to give up a job in order to take care of the children, it is still very much a given that that will be the woman. And so this is of course not the only thing described in this book, but I think that that kind of sums up what I'm talking about. So it's very much talking about how even though the marketplace is now open to females, there are still a lot of restrictions. First of all, because people still take into account the fact that women will have to go on maternity leave at some point or another, and that does affect their chances at career improvements, at getting a higher job, or at sticking to a job, for example. But it is also the case that women are still kind of feel pressured at sometimes to please their superiors, even though their superiors might be showing certain behavior that's not appropriate to our times anymore. And then, as I said before, that there's also this very big prejudice about like mothers going to work, and about mothers having to take care of their children. And yeah, I thought it was really well done, but it wasn't like something new to me. So for me, this book didn't blow me away or anything like that. I have read a lot of books that deal with these aspects in some way or another, but I love that it has sparked a new debate, that it's gotten so much attention in South Korea, and that it's definitely sparked that conversation over there again. I think the main power of this book was also the ending. So at the end we get a male perspective. We get the perspective of the therapist who is kind of diagnosing this character, and so he admits to initially having misdiagnosed her. Initially he kind of thought like mildly on what was wrong with her, so it's like, yeah, it was a little bit on the like, yeah, suck it up side of reasoning, and he's gotten to experience her perspective and her way of life a lot more throughout his sessions with her. And so he admits to having this whole new world open up to him, you know. He's finally understanding this female experience. However, at the same time, he is thinking about how he needs to hire a new assistant, and he doesn't want to hire a certain one because she's probably going to go into maternity leave very soon. So you see that even though he comes to this whole realization of what it's like to be a female in South Korean, and how he had never realized that all of these prejudices that women have to go through. He is perpetuating that same behavior in basically more or less the same page. And so I think that it's a very powerful scene to show that there's still a long way to go, and it won't be self-evident neither, because it's really a change in thought pattern that is needed. And so yeah, there's still a long way to go, and it's not going to be done in the snip of a finger. So these are the books that I read in February. So in total I read 6 physical books and I read 4 audiobooks. So at the beginning of this month I had 138 unread books on my shelf. So by finishing 6 physical ones, that would have been reduced to 132. But as I said in the beginning, I'm also giving you a haul. So let's see what the damage is, and I'm happy to report that I've been very good to myself in that respect this month, and I only bought one. So Queenie by Candice Carty-Williams is the only book that I'm adding in February. So at the end of this month I am left with 133 unread books on my shelves, including Queenie. So Queenie is a book that was published at the end of 2019, and it's been doing the rounds. It's been nominated for a few things as well. It says here as well, I think. I know it doesn't. So it also is nominated for the Costa Book Awards. I think it was on the Waterstone's Best Books of the Year list as well, and things like that. And it seems to be described as a black, what's her name? Bridget Jones' diary. And at the back it very much seems to referring as well to this, that it's like a book about a woman. It's a book about a woman trying to get her life sorted out, you know, to get her life back on track. And I don't know too much more about it. I just know that people have been loving it all over, and I want to try it as well. So yeah, one book for February that I added. So yeah, 133 unread books to go. I think that this is partly also fueling my reading, that I really want to see this get reduced more and more. So yeah, I'm not hating on this at all. I love the fact that I've been able to read so many books, and so hopefully this will continue throughout the year, though of course I don't want to get a burnout from reading too much neither. But so yeah, let me know down below if you've read any of these books and your thoughts on them. Maybe you've had very different experiences from me with some of these books, so definitely let me know down below. I'd love to chat about them and see, like, I like seeing how people have like very different experiences with books from time to time, you know. And then yeah, wish me luck for March, and see you guys for the next one. Bye!